Today's video is brought to you by Skillshare. Nowadays, I rarely shoot 35mm film. For me, getting through 36 images can often be a daunting task, and the slower pace of 6:7 medium format suits me almost perfectly. So why would I ever go and buy a half-frame camera that doubles that number, requiring 72 images to be created before you're done? I really have no idea other than saying that my curiosity got the best of me, and I'm pretty glad that I took the plunge. So I've been curious about half-frame cameras for a while, and I always thought that it looked like it could be a fun format to work with, not necessarily for any serious project-based work, but more so just something to detach and experiment with. So recently I did some research, hopped on eBay, ended up picking up an Olympus Pen EES-2, fired off a couple rolls, and I gotta say, pretty much instantly I fell in love with this little camera. And as I worked with it, I couldn't stop thinking about how great of a tool this is for photographers really of all levels to improve their creative skills, and I'll explain why.
Here I go walking down this long street.
So just got here about an hour and a half ago. The light was pretty amazing this morning, so I didn't do any filming. I just shot 50 pictures instead, which is funny because originally I was like, the thought of having to shoot 72 images on one roll was pretty daunting, so it's funny that it's like 9:30 a.m. and I'm almost on my first roll. But yeah, having fun so far. Interesting shooting experience with this thing, I gotta say.
The reason I'm walking, I can't sleep.
Olympus released their first half-frame camera, the Pen F, back in 1959. And if you're not familiar with these cameras, basically they use a standard roll of 35mm film, but they expose the images in the portrait orientation side by side. So basically 2 images fit in one standard 35mm frame. And Olympus went on to release a number of different models all the way up until the 80s. So if you're looking into buying one of these, it can actually be a little bit overwhelming. There's the original Pen model, then the Pen S, the Pen D, the D2, D3, EE, EES, E2, EE3, EES-2, EED, ED, Pen W, Pen EM, Pen F, Pen FT, and Pen FV, as well as a few others that I'm sure I missed. Out of all those models, I ended up with the EES-2. So the EE models were actually targeted more at the amateur crowd. So they had fixed focus, and then they also had automatic exposure systems. The S model, which I have, Olympus made a few changes, so it actually has 4 different focus zones that you can select from, and then the lens is different as well. So the original EEs, they had a 28mm 3.5, but the S versions came with a 30mm 2.8, so a little bit longer and a little bit faster as well. And I think the 30mm is equivalent to around a 45mm in the 135 format. I'm actually very curious to see how these first images turn out, because this is basically zone focusing, this camera. So it has 4 different settings, infinity and then 3 other ones. And yeah, personally, I hate zone focusing because I just want to know what's in focus and if it's in focus or not. So a little bit of crossing my fingers with this one this morning, but yeah, we'll see what happens. So as I mentioned, this camera has an automatic exposure system. It's super straightforward. You just set the ISO on the dial here on the lens, and the maximum that it goes up to is 400. And I was actually shooting with Lomography Color 800 for this review, but that actually worked out pretty nice just because it gave me a stop of overexposure, which was kind of some nice insurance, especially working with an older meter like this on this camera from the 60s. But I gotta say, I shot 2 rolls of film. Out of all of the images, none whatsoever were underexposed, so I was pretty impressed with that. The camera itself is surprisingly solid in the hands, and in my opinion, it just has the right amount of character, from the body design to the lettering to the overall looks. It's a camera that has a nostalgic feel, yet it still produces pretty nice results. But before we jump into a few of the things that I loved most about this camera, I just want to take a minute to talk about today's sponsor, Skillshare, which is an online learning community for creative and curious people, and one that I've personally been a part of for a few years now as both a student and also a teacher. I've used Skillshare in the past for learning about both photography and filmmaking, and I found that it's a really great place to connect with other creatives and also find encouragement and support in its community. For photographers, they have a ton of different courses to choose from, both creative and technical, like this street and documentary photography course taught by Andre Wagner. This is a style of photography that is completely new to me, and I personally found the course really insightful and inspiring. When it comes to film photography, I also have a course on Skillshare that's been up for about a year, which is for people who are new to the world of film, all about shooting your first roll of 35mm, and I also have a medium format course coming out in the near future. The first 1,000 people to use the link below will get a free trial of Skillshare's premium membership, and then after that, it's only about $10 a month. Let's jump back into things. When it comes to the images from this camera, I gotta say, I was really impressed. Even though the point of buying this camera obviously wasn't for its detail it could render, the images still were surprisingly sharp, especially when you take into account the size of the frame. Color and contrast were great, and even though I was shooting in some bright and backlit conditions, the lens held up, never flared, and actually had some really nice contrast. But even more than the images, it's the creative opportunity that this camera provides that brings with it just a thoughtfulness that isn't always present when you're working with a single frame. You know, like many people do when they're working with half frame, I chose to leave the borders and the dividers and display these images in pairs. And for me, I found that this kind of forced me when I was out shooting to always be keeping an eye out for similar patterns and tones and colors and things like that in the landscape. And in doing that, I couldn't stop thinking about how great of a tool this is for helping photographers develop their vision. Also, at first, I gotta say, the idea of shooting 72 images per roll was a pretty daunting task, but I realized very quickly that it actually made me work in a little bit more of like a carefree, relaxed attitude. And not that I would always recommend that, but I feel like it definitely made me just have some fun with things and experiment a little more. So will I be keeping this camera? Most likely, and I'll explain. But I gotta say, I do love the half frame format, absolutely. I'm gonna be sticking with that, but there were a couple things with this camera that just bothered me a little bit. And the first one is just composing. If you watch this channel, you know I like SLRs. I like to know what's in the frame and what isn't. And I found that this viewfinder wasn't always the most accurate, and I ended up having some things in the frame that weren't there when I was composing, which isn't a huge deal, but when you're working with these film borders and these image pairs, cropping afterwards can be very time consuming and a bit of a pain. So that was the first one. And then the second is just the zone focusing. It's okay, most of my images were in focus, but it's when I got to the closer distances, you know, combined with it being an automatic exposure system where you don't ever know what f-stop you're shooting at, it's hard to judge kind of how much depth of field you will or won't have. And with the closer distances, I found that's where I really started to miss some of the focus. So for me, I'm definitely gonna stick with the half frame format, but I think I'm gonna go out and buy the Olympus Pen F, which is an SLR with interchangeable lenses, and that would pretty much solve both of my issues. Overall, the Olympus Pen EES-2 is just a fun camera to use. And in a world where tech and megapixel counts are becoming hard to keep up with, it feels amazing to get out and fire off some frames using what was most likely someone's vacation camera from the 60s. And not only did I enjoy the process, but I was also genuinely excited about the results. For me, this is a camera that really inspires creativity, and it's a great reminder that sometimes a little less is absolutely more.